All right. So today, guys, we're talking about Dr. Miller's book, The Character Gap. How good are we? And I wanted to just go ahead and give you guys a good explanation of what this is about. So if you'll bear with me, Christian, let me introduce you very well. Okay.
Have at it.
Um, This man is a philosopher and a professor of philosophy at Wake Forest University. He is known for his work in ethics, moral character, and moral psychology. The character gap, in the character gap, he explores the concept of moral character, investigates the question of whether people live up to their own moral ideals or not. He draws on a wide range of sources, including philosophy, psychological data, literary sources, to examine what moral behavior of individuals is and the challenges they face in cultivating what would be called a good character. So, the central idea of the book revolves around the character gap, which refers to the difference between how good we think we are morally and how good we actually are in our everyday actions. And I kind of want to start right there. The character gap book, and Dow's actually had a little bit of this as well. Um, I like the cover, by the way. The difference between Gandhi and Hitler. That's that's a good way to put it to people who are just looking at the cover. But I guess we can start with, what is character?
Sure. So, first of all, thank you for having me on your show, and it's great to be here. So, character I'm thinking of as moral character, and I'm thinking of it as how we're disposed to do three things: think, feel, and act. So, it has a thinking component to it, it has a feeling or motivational component to it, and then it has an outward behavioral component. And it
Hmm.
comes in two varieties: there's good character, which is the virtues, and bad character, which is the vices. So, take the example of the virtues: honesty, or compassion, or justice, or fortitude, or generosity. There's a long list, and then you can flip them around for the vices: invert it, dishonesty, stinginess, cruelty, cowardice, and the like. Let's just take any one of those. To take a virtue like compassion. So when I said it has three components to it, what do I mean? Well, a compassionate person has compassionate thoughts. So um, they recognize when someone's in need. They think it's important to help someone in need. They know the right ways or means to help someone in need. They also have compassionate motivation. So they're concerned for someone in need for the right reasons, not just to make a good impression or to get written up in the newspaper
Right.
or for a tax deduction or for a donation or something like that, but because they care about the person for his or her own sake. They're
Yeah.
altruistically or selflessly motivated. That's the motivational piece. And then the last one is the outward expression. So you have the thinking, you have the motivation that gives rise together to behavior. For
Yeah.
example, actually helping someone, making a donation,
Yeah.
picking up some draw papers, helping someone across the street. So those are the three fundamental pieces of character in my way of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's a good question. I think, how are personality and character different? Is character more moral than what we would consider defining personality?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. You're starting off with a very hard one.
Yeah. Yeah.
I worried about that for a long time. I wrote about it in an earlier book. So I think personality is the broader category, and there's a field called personality psychology, which studies
Right.
personality traits
Yep.
of individuals. And character is a subset of personality, so it's a branch of
Ah.
personality.
Okay.
But it's not the only. It's not exhaustive of personality. So you know,
I.
if we focus on moral character, I
Yeah.
wouldn't want to think of something like introversion or extroversion as part of your
Mhm.
moral character, but it's part of your personality.
Yeah.
To give you an
Perfect.
example, so that's how I'm dividing it up.
Perfect. All right. Well, let's get back to the character gap, because that's what I'm most interested in. So, let's talk about let's talk about what was it? Let's talk about one of the examples. We can get into the examples of how good we think we are, like the Panama City Beach example, and talk about, um, why do we seek to do good? Why do most people, I guess, in a normal distribution, why do they seek to do good things?
Yeah, well, there's so several points there. First of all, there's how good we think we are.
Yeah.
So let's tackle that one.
Okay.
Uh, I and then there's how good we actually are. That's the way you introduced it, and then you just mentioned it again. Um, so what most people, it seems like they think they're pretty good, morally speaking. They're pretty good people. They tend not to have an overinflated view, so inflated that they think they're saints or they're perfect, they don't make any mistakes. You have to be pretty self-delusional to think that. But they tend to give themselves quite a bit of moral credit. And I'm just not saying this from the armchair. There's data on this suggesting that if you ask people to rate their characters from 1 to 5, with 3 being average, 5 being excellent, and 1 being poor, if you ask them to rate their overall moral character, they tend to give themselves a 4 out of 5. If you take particular character traits like honesty or compassion and break it down that way, same thing, but about a 4 out of 5. And if you go cross cultural, because you might say, well, look, Americans, we're so full of ourselves, we're so cocky and so forth. Of course, we have an inflated view, but no, it actually holds up cross culturally consistently. This kind of high view of our character. Now, I want to say that there's a gap, though, between that and the reality, that our actual character, for the most part, is not quite that good. So we'll probably pursue that later on when we get into some of the studies and we get into some of the reasons why I think experimentally uh, our character is much more of a messy mixed bag than we
Yeah,
might have thought.
yeah,
Now, another thing you asked there was, what are some reasons to act morally? Am I right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I know that's kind of a meta ethical question, but I guess I'm asking like in these good examples that are on the, I will post this in my comments. This IAI, uh, is that what it's called? IAI News.
correct.
It's an
Yeah.
article I'd really like to post and everybody be able to read. Um, but no, I mean the human chain
Mhm.
in Panama City Beach. Why do you think that they sought to do the good in that instance?
Yeah. So just for the context, so that article basically distills a lot of the character gap books. So for listeners who want to get a feel for what goes on in the book beyond this interview, I sent them to that article, and you can really get the highlights. There, I used an example of a real life example of someone who was drowning at the beach in Panama City, and rather than just ignore it, the other people on the beach formed a human chain and so linked up together one after the other out to the person who was drowning and was able to bring that person to shore and I think almost certainly save that person's life.
Right.
So great act. Um, Big thumbs up. Does that mean that those people were compassionate or virtuous? We don't know. So why did they do that? I don't. That requires
Yeah.
peering into someone's heart and the motivation behind their actions and
True.
unlocking that. I mean, but here are a couple of points. One is I can't automatically infer virtue because I need to see cross situational consistency. That means that I need to be compassionate. You need to be compassionate at the beach. You need to be compassionate at the office, at home, in lots of different contexts, not just a one-off. Um,
Yeah.
Secondly, I don't know if this was compassion or not. Because I don't know even what the motivation was in this particular instance. We could come up with different candidates. We could say they cared about the person who was drowning.
Yeah.
Or we could say they didn't want to look like they didn't want to have a bad reputation as the only one who was not helping.
Right.
Um, or
Like
here's another one.
shaming. Yeah.
Yeah, another one. I'll stop with this. They didn't want to feel guilty if they didn't help.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a part of the social pressures, right? I'm sure
right.
we'll cover that here in a little while.
So that's three different possibilities. Only the first one is virtuous. The second and third are self-interested. It's a matter of me and my reputation, and or not wanting to have this negative feeling of guilt. That's egoistic, and that's not going to cut it for virtue.
Yeah.
It's again, but I don't want to be too down on this because look, they saved that person's life. I'll take good behavior with potentially crappy motivation any day over bad behavior, right?
I agree.
For sure.
So
I agree. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Dal, did you have a question?
I mean, other than agreeing with you that I think the output of kind actions is more important than internal virtuosity, my question would be, do you think there's a way we can like cultivate virtue?
yeah, now you have to limit me on this one. So, I mean, I can just give you a speech for 30 minutes. So, so here's how the book breaks down, and I'll get to the question. First, I define what character is because I'm a philosopher, and I think we need to know what we're talking about. So we've already said a little bit about that. Then I say, why is it important? Why should we care about it? Why should we bother cultivating virtue? And I have a chapter on that. Then there's a big section in the middle on how are we doing today? Are we living up to the standards of virtue, or are we falling short? And I'm sure we'll get into that later on. And at the end, having kind of seen what the facts are on the ground of, well, our character is, as I'm going to say, is a mixed bag of some good and some bad. At the end, in the last 3 chapters, I start talking about improvements because
Yes.
it would be really a downer to say, well, we're a mixed bag, we're kind of not as good as we think we are, and see you later. Enjoy your life. I
Yeah.
do try and say, look, there is some hope for even if you are not as good as you think you are, and even if you fall short of the standards of virtue, there are things you can do. And fortunately, character is malleable too. So it's not like
Yeah.
it's stuck we're stuck in cement with what we have now.
Yeah.
Um,
Changes
so
over time, right? Like
it,
identity in some
it,
way.
it changes over time, and there's empirical evidence to back that up.
Hmm.
So to give you 2 illustrations of that, and then I'll get to directly to the question. Uh,
Sure.
Conscientiousness is lowest amongst high school students and college students, and then gradually improves over the lifespan. And honesty is the same way. So honesty is the lowest with teenagers, kind of sadly, but maybe not too surprising.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
not surprising.
and then gradually increases over the lifespan too.
Right.
Um, so then, what can we do? Well, what I do is I review 6 different strategies, 3 of which I find not so promising, but I just want people to be aware of them, and maybe there's more to be said for them than I give them credit for. And then I turn to 3 other strategies which I think are promising, and I kind of commend to people. So how about this? Why don't I give you one, and then you can decide whether you want to go to other ones or circle back later on.
Hmm.
Um, so one strategy I look at is looking to moral exemplars, moral role
Yes.
models, moral heroes, moral saints
Yeah.
as a basis for admiration and emulation. So there's a lot packed into that sentence.
Yeah. Keep going, my friend. Keep
Yeah.
going.
So take try to put in your mind, okay, who do I look up to morally speaking, and you can envision that person, and then you admire that person for some quality they have. Maybe not everything about them, because no one's perfect, and there are going to be some flaws. But maybe you admire Lincoln for his honesty, Harriet Tubman for her courage,
Hmm.
Gandhi for his bravery,
Yeah.
Jesus for his wisdom, whatever it might be. But it's not just admiration, because you can admire something from a distance and not have it impact your life. It's
Yeah.
admiration that gives rise to inspiration, where you're emotionally moved to become more like that person in the respect in question.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be a real person, right?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating stuff. They don't have to
Yeah.
be a real person; it can be a fictional person.
Yeah.
So, example I like to use is the priest in Les Mis. Has always been someone I found is a very powerful character who forgives Jean Valjean for something he shouldn't have been forgiven for, maybe. But in the process, turns Jean Valjean's life around. So it's a powerful act of forgiveness. Don't have to be don't have to be real. Also, uh, there's a question about contemporary versus historical. So we tend to go to the kind of more distant exemplars, like, you know, who's who's a good role model for honesty in America. 9 people out of 10 are going to say Abraham Lincoln, Honest Abe, right?
Yeah.
He's got a whole nickname, but empirical research here finds that relatable and kind of people who you interact with, attainable exemplars, are the most powerful. So it's someone I can relate to in my situation today. A little hard to relate to Lincoln. Um,
Yeah.
it's someone who's attainable, someone I think I can actually get there. They're not
Okay.
so much better than me. I can actually make progress towards that person, and I interact with them regularly. It's not a one-off. Like
Yeah.
I moved today, but then I've forgotten 2 weeks later that they're in my life. and they constantly inspire me to become better. So that's one strategy,
Yeah.
called a kind of a moral exemplar strategy.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. I think that we should emulate. It, hilariously enough, I don't know if Dasu will agree with me, but I got to say this: the nerds in us are probably going to say that we got a lot of our morals and our particular morals character from Japanese anime or cartoons and things like that.
Sure, sure, yeah,
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah.
That's
Harry
just what I
Potter.
grew up with,
Yeah,
and that's
yeah.
the morals that I took upon myself.
Yep. I mean, my kids, Harry Potter's big for them, and
Yeah,
Pokemon's very big for them.
yeah.
We're reading Lord of the Rings right now, so
Oh,
but I don't want to get this good segue us.
no, it's all right. Well, we talked just to get us back on track. We talked about how to cultivate virtue, what is good, why do people do good things. Do you want to cover the Walter Vance? I mean, I'll talk about it, but I was just, do you want to go back to that, or do you want to move on to something else?
You're steering the ship.
Okay, all right, all right. So, audience, an example: the story of Walter Vance, a 61-year-old man who was shopping at his local Target for Christmas decorations. It was Black Friday, and the store was mobbed like every place is on Black Friday when Vance fell to the floor in cardiac arrest and laid motionless on the floor. The other shoppers did nothing. In fact, some people even stepped over his body to continue shopping. Eventually, a few nurses used a CPR, but by the time that happened, it was too far gone. So the question is, why do strangers help in one situation and simply ignore someone in need in another?
Yep. Yep. So uh, this is the story I lead with in the book. It's the opening story. It's the kind of hook I try to draw readers in. It's a powerful story. It's a real life story and a very disturbing one. Uh,
Yeah, very.
Very, for sure. And it's actually been found to be not idiosyncratic to human nature. So, what do I mean by that? Later in the book, I have a chapter on helping. And there I talk about what has now become a familiar phenomenon, but it hasn't always been the group effect or bystander effect. Uh, so, in the 1960s, there were some researchers who wanted to see whether the presence or absence of a stranger who did nothing would make a difference to helping. Just like in the real world example that you just read, there were all kinds of strangers around Walter Vance, and they did nothing. But we moved it into the lab, and they were, saying, can we not just have this one isolated example from Target, but can we actually replicate this, so to speak, in the lab? Forget the fact it was 1960s.
Yeah.
It's not going back in time. But the point being, can we actually tap into something about human psychology that is going to have kind of disturbing effects for helping? And the answer was yes. So here's how they did it. You would come into the lab, you were told to fill out a survey, you sat down, you worked on the survey. A few minutes later, the person in charge comes into the room again with a stranger, tells the stranger, fill out the survey. The stranger starts filling out the survey as well. And then the person in charge leaves. So the two of you are working on your surveys, you don't know each other. A few minutes go by, and then there's a sound from the next room. And the person in charge, you can recognize that that's the person in charge's voice. There's a crash. She starts screaming. She says, my leg, I can't get this off of me. It sounds like something's fallen on top of her. She can't get it off. And something's clearly going, it seems to me, I wasn't there, but it seems to me something clearly is going wrong in the next room. Now, would you help? Well, I would say, of course I would help. And I'm sure the two of you would say, of course you would help. And if you were by yourself in that room doing the survey, it's likely you would. So in that version, 70% participants helped.
Oh, okay.
Now, I don't know what's going on with the 30%. That's kind of very disturbing itself, but the 70 helped.
Yeah.
But in the version where you're in a room with a stranger and you both work on the surveys, the crash happens in the next room, and the stranger does nothing to help, just keeps working on the survey. It's very unlikely that you're going to help either. In this version, 7% helped.
Oh my God.
It's a stunning number. 7% versus 70%. And what was the only change? The presence or absence of a stranger who was not helping.
Yeah.
And then this got a huge amount of attention, of course, and it got replicated that version, but in other versions where they change the emergency, this person gets electrocuted. And there's one where it's a child abuse version. I mean, there's all kinds of very disturbing ones. But the
Yeah,
point
the
being,
shock ones were bad. I read about that, and I was like, wow, even up to a lethal jolt, right?
well,
That
that's a whole big can of worms too. That's the Milgram shock experiments.
Yeah, we can talk about those. Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, that's fascinating too. But just to wrap this one up,
yeah, sure.
um, the point being that this has now been replicated because in psychology, I'm sure many of your listeners have heard about this replication crisis, where many
Mhm.
famous studies have had like surprising results, but then other experimenters come along later and try to replicate the study, and they don't get the results anymore, and it calls into question the validity of the finding. Well, this
Yeah.
one has been replicated many times, and there have been many real world analogs of this besides the Walter Vance one. You can actually see every year a few of these kind of situations in the news. So, what is it? Why do I even focus on this example? Well, to me, this is a perfect illustration of why our character tends to be not as good as we think it is.
Mhm.
Because most people would say, of course, I would do something. Even if the stranger was not helping, I would do something. So they have this kind of optimistic view about their character. Well, lo and behold, the results actually
Yeah.
suggest otherwise.
The
And so
social
it's
stress is like too much, right? I'm sorry to interrupt
yeah,
you.
yeah, no. So yeah, so what's the explanation? There, we don't know for sure. Again, it's this question of peering into people's psychology and wondering why they do what they do, their
Right.
motivation. But the researchers had at least a thought that fear of embarrassment might be playing a role.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Embarrassment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that does this other person know something that I don't know? Why
Right.
surely they heard the emergency. They're not responding. Maybe they have a piece of information. Maybe they like heard that there was going to be a movie recording or like an actor or something like that. And so if I get up and go into the next room and kind of run off to help, only to find out that it wasn't really an emergency,
Yeah.
I've made a fool of myself in front of the stranger.
Yeah.
I've embarrassed
But
myself.
what's wrong with that, right? It could be helping somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, even if that's were to be the case, it's entirely reasonable,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you're not going to get blamed for it, but you do deserve blame if you don't help.
Yeah. Evil thrives when good men do nothing.
Yeah,
If it is a
very well
trick, now they got you on camera not helping.
said.
Dow, did you have something to say about the lady in distress study? That's what we've been talking about. The
Man,
other room.
I don't think I have any other than just shock, just pure shock at like
Yeah.
the 7% number. And again, just asking because it's the craziest part to me is that there was a lot like it's more understandable if you're like in a social situation and I'm imagining like fancy music playing like a dinner party and then like there's like some quiet like a cat fight in the or something quiet in the background, but it's like a crash and someone yelling for help in the next room and you're in a quiet room doing a study and there's one other person not reacting and that's all it takes. It just like hurts my soul.
It does hurt my soul a bit too. Did they ever do any studies with more than just one person in there? Or
I I have to go back and check. I'm pretty confident the answer is yes, but I can't say for sure.
yeah,
There have been plenty of real world analogs of this, like the Walter Vance's one. And in fact, you someone in a room with 10 people who don't help.
yeah,
That's even more fear of embarrassment that you have to overcome to be the
yeah.
one who steps up and help. So I would expect that it would be kind of incremental. More people who don't help, the less that the percentage is just going to go down and down and down.
This is seemingly how people get trampled at concerts.
I
You know what I mean? Like
do, yeah,
I've been to a lot of concerts and seen people fall down, and everybody assumes, oh well, their significant other or their friends or whatever will get them up. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
It just
It's
doesn't.
not just
That's
trampled
not
on.
always the case.
Yeah, but left there. Yeah, I mean left there for a long time. Right.
Yeah, they could be passed out. They could have hit their head. And
Yeah.
I think it's that thing of just overcoming the embarrassment.
Mhm. Yep. Yep.
So we've illustrated the darker side of our character. This line right here, we also tend to lie to about 30% of the people we see in a given day. That's crazy. And I thought about it and I was like, I can actually believe that.
Yeah. So this is true as far as what I reported from the study, but I need to round out the picture a little bit more.
Okay.
So, and then if we have time, let's also mention cheating because
Please
I
do.
think that,
Yeah.
that's quite fascinating as well.
Yeah.
So when I wrote the book, I studied that study. This is a kind of classic result from the leading lying researcher in the world, Brenda DiPaolo, and she found that in a community sample, about one lie per day was told. In a student sample, about two lies per day were told. Um, and it became kind of the standard assumption in the lying literature that lying was pretty frequent.
Yeah.
So I use that as well, again, as kind of grist for my mill of saying our character is often not as good as we think it is. Subsequently, I headed up a project called the Honesty Project, and I wrote a book called Honesty, the Philosophy and Psychology of Neglected Virtue, and I'm now writing a trade version of that. So I'm like all in the honesty stuff right now. And newer research turned out to find that the picture is a little bit more complicated. Averages paint over individual differences. So if you say, like, people average two lies a day, well, is that every individual person says two lies a day? Or is it that half say four and half say zero? Or some other, there are all kinds of combinations to get you two a day. And so some more recent literature has asked the question, let's break it up in a more individual level and see, okay, individually, how many lies do you tell? And the result has been that there's a kind of clustering of, in one study, 60% of people told zero lies in the last 24 hours. 35% told a few lies. And 5% told a lot of lies.
Yeah.
So that there are groups of different kinds of people here. And there are these big liars or prolific liars, and they tell so many lies that they boost the average themselves.
Yeah.
So we don't want to kind of paint with a broad brush.
Right. Not everybody's a compulsive liar, right?
Exactly. And this is, again, kind of grist for the mill because my story is never we're vicious. It's easy when we hear like the study about the not helping in the group context and the Milgram shock study and these kind of things. This is depressing. Wow, people are awful. Yeah. The lesson must be that we're vicious people. And that's never been my lesson. That's never been my conclusion. It's always been we have some good sides to our character. We have some bad sides to our character. We're a mixed bag. But that there's, it's worth highlighting the positive too.
I think so.
Don't overlook the negative.
Yes. Do you want to briefly touch on the shock experiments before we move on, or did you?
Sure.
What are they called again? You said something shock experiment.
Yep. So it's called the Milgram shock experiments. Because they were run by Stanley Milgram, Milgram.
Okay.
In the 1960s, he was a professor of psychology at Yale, and I think I'm not a psychology professor, but I think this is pretty safe to say that it's the most famous study in psychology, maybe ever. But certainly top 5. So here's how it goes. You come into the lab. You're told that you're going to administer a test to someone in the next room. So you're the test administrator. Okay, so you sit down. You have the test. You also told that the person in the next room is hooked up to an electric shock machine. So every time they get a wrong answer, you are supposed to turn a electric shock dial a little higher. And so you start the test. Maybe they get the first one right. You don't have to do anything. Maybe question 2 they get wrong. Okay, you turn the dial up a little bit. You get a little shock. Test goes on. Now, of course, it's rigged, so there's going to be a lot of wrong answers. So as time goes on, the dial you're supposed to turn up more. Well, as the dial gets higher up, suddenly you start seeing, well, not suddenly because it's gradual, you start seeing a more severe reaction from the person in the next room. They start crying. They start screaming in pain. They pound on the walls. They say, I have a heart condition. Get me out of this. Stop. And what happens? Well, now I'll introduce the final variable in this. Over your shoulder is an authority figure who's kind of dressed like a scientist, looking very official.
Mhm.
And if you start hesitating or saying, I don't know if I want to do this anymore, that authority figure will say things like, please continue. You must continue.
Yeah.
And so as time goes on and the participant turns and turns and turns, they're not forced to do it. I mean, they even though they're told to do it, they're not forced to. They can leave at any point. But over 60% of the participants keep turning the dial up, 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 up to the XXX level, which
Yeah.
is the lethal level of shock, at which point the person in the next room has gone silent. So the implication being now just two things. First, that ordinary people can be brought to kill innocent people of their own free will. And secondly, just to make sure that for those who are not familiar with it, this was all rigged. So don't go, panicking. There was a person in the next room, but they were not actually getting the shocks. They were acting and being really good about it. So no one was killed. But the participants didn't know that. The participants thought it was real. In fact, afterwards, they would, even after they were debriefed, of course, they were told that it was fake. But afterwards, they were shaking, they were sweating, they were nervous wreck because they thought that they had killed an innocent person. So, what's the point of this? Well, again, if you ask people, would you ever do this, or would you expect like most Americans to do this? This was actually a question before the study was done in the '60s. They said, "No, I would never do this," or most Americans would never do this. Turns out, the majority did do it.
Yeah.
So again, our character tends to not be as good as we think it is,
especially in the under the shoulder of an authority figure, for sure.
Yeah,
that's always going to be a problem, especially with group think and in group out group dynamics and all that. So that's right, cheating. I guess, studies obviously have found that we're willing to cheat for monetary gain when we can get away from it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's your words right there. But there's also, did you want to elaborate on just, how cheating plays its role in this?
I can. I'm a professor, so it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It's of course not wanting there to be cheating. It's trying to get rid of it. Coming up with whatever strategy I can to prevent it from happening. But these days with ChatGPT, it's especially worrisome. But I've not dived into that. When I wrote the book, there wasn't even such a thing. And I wish there wasn't. At least from a cheating perspective. So rather than talk about like lots of studies, I'll just give you one example here.
Okay.
It's my favorite one, where again, it's participants. It involves a test. This is kind of a recurring theme. Participant comes in, takes a test, has 20 problems. This time you're going to get paid 50 cents per correct answer. So this is unlike tests I give where I don't pay my students for getting things right. This test, you get 50 cents per correct answer, 20 problems. In the control condition, which is like our baseline, the participants just take the test, they turn it in, the person in charge grades it and pays them for based on their performance. In the example I'll give here, it varies based on which test it is, so the studies aren't always the same, but the one I'll give, 7 out of 20 is the baseline. Now, the interesting one is different participants come in, given the same test, 50 cents per correct answer, but they grade the test themselves.
Oh.
When they're done, they do the grading. They destroy all the materials. They shred everything. It's called the shredder study. You can kind of see where this is going to go. And they just can say whatever they want to the person in charge and get paid accordingly. So they could say 0, they could say 7, they could say 14, they could say 20. And there's no questions asked. There's no suspicion. And in this one I'm thinking of, again, it was 14 out of 20 was the average.
Of course, doubled.
So it's clear to me that those people saw an opportunity to make money, get away with it, and they chose to benefit themselves.
I think people, what's called, desensitize themselves more to cheating and like lying and stuff rather than murder and rape and those kind of things. It's kind of desensationalized in people's minds
Yeah,
compared to other crimes. You know what I mean?
that's fair, I mean it's less harmful.
Right.
It's less morally weighty, and the consequences are not as bad. And he might even say, "Look, it's even your point even holds to a greater extent in this case because this is an artificial lab. I mean, it's
Hmm.
not like a real test where with a real professor. This is like some psychologists who are doing this game and are paying me, and so who cares if I take advantage of it? It's not.
Right. Right.
I'm not going to lose my degree. I'm not going to fail the class or anything like that. I might
Yeah.
as well take advantage of it. They're kind of giving me the golden opportunity to. Why not?
Yeah.
So I don't think we should like draw huge implications from this because it is artificial. It's not the kind of real world context,
It
um,
is.
but it is interesting that there was such a big split, such a big spread, and then to add one more wrinkle to it, a third group uh, signs the honor code or honesty pledge. We have an
Mm.
honor code at Wake Forest, my university. Um, so they first sign the honor code, pledging their honor that they're not going to lie, cheat, or steal. Take the test, 50 cents per correct answer, grade it themselves. Uh, what happens in this group? The average goes back down to the baseline. No evidence of cheating in this group. Um, so it fits in very well with my picture of mixed character again. Because if we were really rampantly dishonest people, cheaters, it wouldn't have mattered whether we
Yeah.
signed the honor code. We would have signed it anyway because it's a formality, and it's expected of us. And then we would have turned around and cheated and made a ton of money and gotten the best of both worlds. Good reputation for signing the honor code and lots of money, but we didn't.
Yeah.
The people didn't. There's a nice positive spin there, a nice piece of
Yeah.
positiveness.
We're going to get into the positivity, I think, for a minute here. I love the idea about Daniel Batson. Is that his name?
Right. Yep.
Batson.
That's it. Yep.
Uh, 30 years of fascinating research on how empathy can have a profound impact on our desire to others in need. I'm a big preacher of empathy. I am a. Uh, I try to seek altruism. I know it's not we can't perfectly be altruistic, but I care about empathy very much, and I think that's an answer, like you said, or like you said in this, in one study, after Batson got students to empathize with a complete stranger experiencing a terrible tragedy, the number of students willing to help her dramatically rose to 76% compared to the 37% in a control group. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's
That's a good way
awesome.
to put it. Yeah. So you're right to highlight the positivity. I want to do that too.
Yeah.
A great place to go to is empathy. Um, and there are two facets to this that I think are really positive. One is the behavior. So people who empathize with the suffering of others help alleviate that suffering much more than those who don't. So helping behavior goes way up, usually when there's empathy. But it's not just that. The really, really cool part of this, and this is Batson also, is the underlying motivation.
Mm.
Why is empathy so impactful? And what reason do people have to help? Because again, as we touched on at the beginning, there could be a myriad of different reasons. Everything from making a good impression to guilt avoidance to rewards in the afterlife to shame avoidance. I mean, just go down the list. But Batson and there's lots of details here. I'll just skim over, but he's tested all those alternatives. He's devised experiments that will allow him to see: is it guilt? Is it shame? Is it this? Is it that? Is it that? And the only one he's ever found evidence for, in the case of empathy, is selfless motivation. Uh,
Mm.
that people who empathize with the suffering of others not only want to help them, but they want to help them for their own sake, to benefit them for their own sake, independent of whether they benefit or not.
Right.
This is genuinely altruistic or selfless motivation. So that's really impressive and
I think it
encouraging
is. I
because
think it is.
if you want virtue, you've got to get past self interest.
Yes. Do say we're going to continue speaking about the good things and things that you said we can do It said, you said, fortunately, there are promising strategies that aim to reduce what I call the character gap, or the space between how we should be virtuous people and how we actually tend to be a mixed bag. So you said emulating role models. We talked about that earlier. That's extremely important. I think we covered that pretty well. And you said it was really important to remember that these are people in your life that you see, that you talk to, that can really mean something to someone as opposed to some maybe fictional character or something that you don't get to daily interact with. Is that right?
That's correct. Yep, yep. You
Yeah.
nailed that. So I'm happy to touch on a couple others if you like.
Please do. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
So there's one that I think more highly of now than I did when I wrote the book. And then there's one that I thought highly of when I wrote the book, and I still think highly of. So the one I wish I had highlighted some more is the role of moral reminders.
Yes.
So in our, I think it's fair to say that most people have a pretty good idea of right and wrong and good and bad. Maybe not on every single point, but on just ordinary points like I shouldn't cheat on my taxes, I shouldn't cheat on this test, I shouldn't cheat on my
Yeah.
life. These kind of things are pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But what can happen is that self-interest can get in the way, and in certain particular situations, we can be tempted to go astray from our moral values and do something like cheat on a test.
Yeah.
So, what moral reminders do is they help bring back to our conscious or even unconscious attention what we think already is right and wrong. So that's pretty abstract. Let me give an illustration. In fact, I've already given an illustration a few minutes ago.
You did, yeah.
So the honor code, I like honor codes a lot. We have one at Wake Forest. Whenever students in my class take a test, they have to not only sign their name to the honor code, we read it aloud as a class. I read it with them. We all recite it before we go into the test. And the point is, it's functioning as a moral reminder. So, remind you why you are here at Wake Forest, what we care about as an institution, what we value, what I value, what I'm going to be expecting you to live up to, what you would probably already want to live up to yourself.
Right.
All that's now fresh in their mind, and then they can go in and take the test. So that's a specific illustration of how moral reminders work. There are plenty of others as well.
Yeah.
But everything from starting your day with a reading, ending your day with a diary. Some people diary about
Yeah.
how they could have done it better that day. So that's one thing. And then another strategy I'll highlight has to do with greater self-awareness.
Yes.
And so this is what I
I
call.
wanted to touch a lot on that, by the way, so we will get back to it. Before you go on that real quick,
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to share with you one of my moral reminders, and then I'd like to see what Dal has to
Yeah.
say, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Mine is a bit morbid. I've suffered with bipolar for a long time. I'm on the right medication now, so all is well. But I thought about death all the time, and it really made me think that life was precious. You know what I mean? It really made me. We could die in 10 seconds. You know what I mean? We could have a brain aneurysm and just drop dead. And that's kind of what you said. It says the customers in that Target who ignored Walter Vance lying on the ground had lost sight of what was important in life. And I think that's because life is precious. You know what I mean? Every moment of existence is precious.
Yeah. You illustrated the point better than I did.
Dal, did you have a moral reminder you wanted to jump in with, or?
I mean, leading into my personal moral reminder that I'm wearing on my neck, Lao Tzu, which is kind of he kind of reminds me to allow my inner child to express itself and to accept each moment with like in its essence, and to kind of just be pure hearted as I can be and try to handle the situation with that. And I think the whole conversation has made me think a lot of religiosity in general, and just people's connection with their faith and their different symbols. Like I have a Ganesha somewhere, which does something similar, kind of helps me think of things morally. And I was also thinking, I want to say it was either Vsauce, the YouTuber, or it was like Mythbusters. They did this thing where they had a bowl of money that you were supposed to give $1 to or something, and they'd put a bunch of money in there, and sometimes people would walk by and take money out of there, and then they painted put a picture of a big eyeball up on the wall, and then the people wouldn't steal from it anymore because there was like this eye watching them. And I'm wondering, like, how many other cultures putting religious symbols on the wall had a similar effect, where it's like a reminder that God is watching you. Or
Yep, yep. A lot of great points. So I really like that you've got a very tangible illustration for us around your neck. Um, so I like the eyes. That's a kind of very famous uh, illustration of this point.
Hmm.
And there are, as you rightly noted as well, there are all kinds of other religious reminders like this. So WWJD bracelets were a thing for a while. People used to wear that was meant to be a religious reminder. I accept all your points. So you all nailed it. Yeah.
Excellent.
beautiful.
Excellent. Well, let's talk about the really important one. I don't want to keep you over time. Um, so this is the most important one, I think, and it's learning about yourself. And I can't press this enough to the audience. You need to learn about your feelings, your emotions, and your thoughts. You need to be metacognizant a little bit in order to examine these things as they happen. Getting to know yourself is a huge deal. Can you speak on that for us?
Sure. Yep. Yep. Very, very good. So I call it getting the word out, which
Mm.
doesn't seem like from the name it connects, but here's how I'm thinking of it. So it is all about self-awareness, this strategy. Um, it's trying to develop a greater understanding of what our own psychology is like, or what our own character is like, so that we can be aware of um, tendencies to do bad or wrong and work against them, as well as be aware of tendencies that are more positive and try to enhance them. So let me give an example to make it not so abstract.
Hmm.
And then why is it getting the word out? Uh, so go back to the group effect again, where the bystander, and you don't help because the other person is not doing anything.
Hmm.
That was big news. So was Milgram. I mean, we could use either one of them. Those were big news at the time because people were so radically mistaken about what they thought their own psychology was like.
Mm.
People thought that, of course, I would help, even if someone else wasn't helping. And of course, I would never turn the shock dial all the way up, even if there was an authority figure. Lo and behold, yes, you would. Um, and if you're like most people, and so what we learned then is we gain greater self awareness of some tendencies in our mind which we didn't even know existed before.
Mm.
Tendencies in particular, and this ties nicely as well, about how strong fear of embarrassment is.
That's what I was going to cover. Yeah. We can, through learning about ourselves, we can realize that embarrassment means nothing
Right.
compared to somebody's safety in their life.
Right. That's right. That's right. Yep. So we can be in situations where maybe we're hanging back or we're not doing anything. And then we can realize, why am I not doing anything? Do I have any good reason for it? No, it's probably just fear of embarrassment. That's not a good reason. And I can, hopefully rise to the challenge and step up to the plate.
Yeah.
So that's getting the word out, as in learning not just about ourselves kind of in isolation, left to our own devices, but also benefiting from existing research, benefiting from what we're learning about the mind and psychology, so that
Hmm.
that information can better inform us about what's going on in here. So one last illustration of this is
Sure.
a study from the 70s. So it's old and it needs to be replicated. And so I'm not going to make too much of it. But
Right.
in this study, they taught the bystander effect to students who'd never heard of it before. And then later on that day, there was a staged emergency with a non-responsive bystander. So it's like we just talked about, someone needed help. People around weren't doing anything. What happened? Helping shot up way higher. Um, Even another version where it's 2 weeks later. So these students had been to a lecture, they had learned about the bystander effect, and then 2 weeks later, they happened to be in a situation where it was rigged, but they didn't know it, and there was an emergency and no one else was doing anything to help. In that version, I believe it was something like 40% helped.
Oh,
So much higher than the 7% in the old
yeah.
study. Now, again, I'm not going to say that student study is perfect and needs to be replicated, but it reinforces the point that maybe if we learn about these tendencies, we're more cognizant of them, we can also work against them and prevent them from leading us astray.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. um, I want to read this for the audience. Um, it says, have psychologists found any evidence that this kind of thing actually happens? I think you were talking about embarrassment and stuff. So admittedly, there are very few studies in the literature on embarrassment, but one which is relevant to overcoming embarrassment was run by the University of Montana psychologist. Is it Arthur Beeman? Am I
Yeah,
saying that right?
that's the one I
Arthur Beeman.
was just talking about. Uh-huh.
Yeah, he wanted to see what effect learning our own psychology could have on reducing the negative impact on helping of being in a group. And when students in the study came across a staged emergency in the presence of an unresponsive stranger, only 25% helped. But for the students who had attended a lecture on the psychology of groups and helping 2 weeks earlier, 42% helped. So that tells me that we need to teach psychology to younger people.
Start
Well,
spray painting it on walls and stuff.
I mean, so two things about that. One is, it's still only 42%. So you could say, look, that the majority still didn't help.
Yeah,
That's unfortunate. But heck, I'm a professor, and if my lectures had that impact 2 weeks later, that big of a difference, even though it's still not majority, I would be absolutely thrilled.
yeah,
So I'll take that any day. And
yeah.
so why not? I mean, the more we learn
Would
about,
you say that the more we learn about our own psychology and what psychology is, the more empathy that we could probably learn about?
we could.
I know
I
that's
think
a hard question.
we could take that. I mean, I think we could take that in a couple different ways. We might have uh, more empathy. We might be inclined to be more empathetic towards the suffering of others because we're learning about how powerful empathy is and how it's a source of altruistic motivation. So we might be motivated to be more empathetic. We could also be more empathetic of other people for when they don't do the right thing,
Yeah,
because we could say, "Look, I recognize that you're like most people. You're a mixed bag." Um, and I realize that there are some challenges that you might not even be aware of. You didn't defy that authority figure. Well, guess what? Most people don't defy authority figures, even to the point of killing innocent people. So I'm more empathetic for you not rising to the challenge because I know about this research. And I guess a third way it could work is I may be more empathetic with myself,
hmm
in a sense of, um, you know, wanting to do what's good for myself,
yeah,
uh, while recognizing that I've got a long way to go to improve. So I
yeah,
think I never
exactly.
thought about it that way. So I need to kind of talk it through, but I think there are multiple ways that could work out.
I think so. What's just a random question? Of all these percentages and stuff, there was only one that was over 50%, and that was the one that was what was the 7 and the 70? I can't remember now that I
Yeah,
just said.
yeah.
Yeah.
The group.
Was that the only one over 50%? I mean, even in that one we read a minute ago, the 42%, like you said, most didn't help. So are we looking at a kind of a trend there where it's always going to be a low percentage of people who
Well,
help?
there was an earlier one too, with the empathy.
Yeah.
So when the students empathized with the suffering of a fellow student,
Yeah.
more than half were willing to sign up to help her, even though they didn't know her.
Yeah.
That's pretty impressive.
That's
Uh,
powerful. Yeah.
so what you can do actually is kind of put these on kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, more than half were willing to, and significantly more than half were willing to help a stranger at their university when they empathize with their suffering. On the flip side, only 7% were willing to help someone who is in an emergency. Uh, so you've got this kind of two extremes, like the good and the bad.
Yeah.
Again, our character is a mixed bag.
Yeah.
It fits perfectly with the story I'm trying to tell.
I think so. I love how you title it the character gap. That's such a I mean, I want to think that I want to do good things. You know what I mean? Like I'm sure that there are malignant narcissists out there, antisocial personality disorder people out there, you know, They most likely don't want to do good things. But is it intrinsic to just the character of an average human being to want to be good?
So let me say a preliminary point, and then it'll buy me some time to think about that one.
Okay. Sorry.
The preliminary point is, on my picture, I want to reinforce that I've got a bell curve model here,
Yeah.
as far as people actually being good or bad or mixed. So I'm not saying that everyone is a mixed bag. I'm saying it's a bell curve, and so most people are in the middle of having this mixed character. There are going to be outliers, though. There are going to be some quite virtuous people, and we've already talked about some exemplars. And there are going to be some quite vicious people, and then you also have your psychopaths who maybe are not even moral agents in the first place.
Right.
So I want to make that clear. As far as wanting to be good, so I see a lot of research positing a couple of different desires. One is a desire to be thought of as good by other people. So we want to have a good image in the eyes of other people. But that's quite a different thing, though. I mean, that's compatible with being quite bad. But a second is we also want to think of ourselves as good people.
Yeah.
So that's not quite the same thing either, though, because wanting to think of yourself as good and wanting to actually be good are not technically the same thing. You could deceive yourself into thinking that you're good.
Yes.
As far as wanting to actually be a good person, at this point I don't have any data to. I'm sure there is out there. I just don't know of it off the top of my head.
That's okay.
But I would speculate that most people at least want to be good people. Yes. But it tends to be somewhat selective in particular situations.
Yeah.
I want to be a good person, but in this one particular situation where I could make some money by inflating my performance on the test and not get caught, is it really a big deal if I say I got 14 right as opposed to 7 right?
Right.
No, probably not. So wanting to be good, yes, but willing to selectively fudge that in particular situations, if I can benefit, also
Yeah.
seems to be commonplace.
Yeah. And I mean, we're never going to, I look at evolutionary psychology a lot. So, I mean, I know that's not a perfect science. I know there's a lot of arguments against, but I mean, I think a lot of the reasons why people want to be good is because empathy is natural to societies, I think. That's just my opinion. I think if we didn't ever have empathy, we couldn't have a family unit, and if we didn't ever spread that empathy, then we wouldn't have any social or group units, and then so on and so forth up to the society that we have now.
Yeah.
So if we can tap into that primal empathy that everyone has, I think we'd solve a great many issues.
Yeah. So I'm like you. I'm a big fan of empathy. There is some. I wish we tapped into it more. And yes, it would solve a great many issues. There has been, I'm sure you're aware, some recent pushback against it. In particular, Paul Bloom has a book arguing against empathy. So there's a little bit of controversy now about this. Always happens in academia.
Of course.
There's a lot of enthusiasm for some idea. Then along comes someone who says it's all nothing.
Yeah.
But here's a reasonable point, though. Why we shouldn't go overboard. You can empathize with the suffering of a particular person to the neglect of considerations of fairness and justice. So, for example, it's not an original example to me. You know someone who needs an organ transplant. You have control over the transplant list. So you can move people up and down the list, and you don't know anyone else on the list, but you know this one person, and you know them well, and you really empathize with them and the suffering they're going through. And they're number 7 on the list. And your empathy might lead you to try and help them, alleviate their suffering. Well, how can you do that? Well, you can move up the list. You move up to number 1. Well, if you did that, you might be empathizing with them, but you're also
lacking for another person wanting that same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So it'll be unjust. So has to be the case that, like all of morality, we have to balance these different considerations against each other.
Mm,
It's
that's the
not just
hardest part.
it's not just one magical concept or value that we just run with all through morality, like empathy or
Yeah,
justice or honesty. It's got to be a balancing act because sometimes these things conflict. When they conflict, we need to assess which one's more important.
I agree with the balancing act entirely, and I think Dalsuit even probably has something to say about that. What do you think about the
Just-
balance?
I'm just imagining stealing food for your kids and just all the scenarios where the like, what is it? The like Kantian unify. I forgot what what it's
Yep,
called, what he calls it, but
yep, yep.
um,
So you're quite right to go in the Kant direction because Kant famously held that lying is always wrong.
Yeah, the categorical. Yeah,
Yeah,
imperative.
so he took it. I mean, he has this idea of the categorical imperative, and he has different formulations of it. But then he has this essay where he argues that lying is always wrong, and he has this axe murderer example, which gets updated as the Nazi at the door. And in a Nazi at the door example,
Yeah,
you're protecting a Jewish family, and the Nazis are looking for the Jewish family, and they come knocking on your door, and they ask you, do you know where this Jewish family is? And you can lie or you can tell the truth. And so it's exactly, you're right to go that
yeah,
direction because if you're, and this goes back to the point about not resting on one value, if you're like absolutist about never lying, then you're going to have to tell the truth to the Nazi at the door.
hmm
Well, almost no one accepts that. Almost everyone I talk to says, no, the right thing to do is to lie to the Nazi at the door. So in that kind of case, we weigh two values. We weigh honesty against compassion, and in this case, compassion outweighs honesty. But in other cases, it's the reverse. Honesty outweighs compassion. So it's never a black and white kind of list of
yeah.
virtues or one absolute value or anything like that. Ethics is murky and it's messy.
Very spectrum based. Yeah, very, very. Yes, I get exactly what you mean, and I think our audience does too. I don't want to keep you too long. You let me know. I was going to let Dow say a few things or if he had any questions for you, because I think I've pretty much covered every question I had for you, and I've absolutely loved this. I
Well,
love this, man.
I think you've done a masterful job, and I think
Thank you.
covered everything I would want to cover. So
Exactly.
yeah,
I want to say this before Dow says something. Guys, please go out and buy The Character Gap. How good are we? It's on sale, I think, Oxford University Press
correct.
at $28.99. Guys, go out and buy it.
Oh,
Read
even no. $14.
Oh, is
Paperback,
it 14? Excellent.
even cheaper.
Excellent.
Even
Even
cheaper.
better. Even better.
great Christmas gift.
Yeah, great Christmas gift. Dow, did you have anything you wanted to wrap up on there? Did you have anything you wanted to? Because we can talk for a few more minutes.
I think any questions I had have been answered that I can think of. Like,
Well, what do you think about teaching psychology to younger people?
I think it's a must. I think there's so much we need to teach to younger people that we don't, that we're like holding off for later grades or for high school. But like philosophy and psychology and a lot of the things that teach you how to introspect and just like consider moral quandaries and morality in general, we have to be doing that from day one. And I think leaving it to the parents has kind of always been the thing, but I think we need that in at some level, just it, for everyone in society
Yeah.
as well.
Moral coaching.
Yeah, or something, whatever, however
Something like that. Well, go ahead.
It's easy for me to say this. I'm at a liberal arts school, so we make our students take a wide variety of courses. They can't just like lock into engineering from day one and never do anything else. But I also recognize that there are lots of schools where that is the case. Big state schools, it's probably not as realistic for students to be exposed to a wide variety of subjects areas. But um, ideally, in my kind of dream scenario, even earlier into high school, there would have already been some initial exposure to philosophy, for example.
Agreed.
I think it's a real shame that we teach history, we teach English, we teach math, we teach all these other subjects, but we don't teach philosophy earlier on. And when I get my students an introduction to philosophy, almost none of them have ever
Yeah.
gotten even a smidgen of it. So having said that, It's not just a matter of character either. I think that philosophy and psychology raise big issues about the meaning of life, you know, um, objective reality, purpose, uh, afterlife, supernatural
Yeah,
considerations,
yeah,
all kinds of big questions.
yeah,
Happiness, flourishing, uh, whether they settle them or not is another matter. But frankly, no discipline in the humanities at least settles anything. It's always an open question. There's always more to talk
yeah,
about. But just
yeah,
bringing out those issues up and wrestling with them, I
yeah.
think is incredibly valuable.
I think it is too, and I want to start a movement where get psychology in high schools. You know what I mean? Get it in there. Get philosophy in high schools, but
I mean,
maybe
knowing
that's
how
Sounds
effective the
good.
reminders are, again, like let's spray paint some of this on walls, buy some billboards, something, throw up some of these studies, just and find some catchphrases.
there you go. Well, all right, guys, we've had a good fun time with our friend Dr. Miller, and we've had a good time with Dal Su. Please subscribe to my channel, Thomas Pangburn. Excuse me, Thomas Panther at the Pangburn Universe on YouTube. You can find all my interviews there, and you can find this interview there as well. Please go out and buy the book, The Character Gap. And anybody else have anything they want to say before we go? Nope. All right.
Thank you for
Well,
having
thank
me
you
on.
guys so much for
Yeah.
coming and watching us. We love you all, and have a good night.